Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Marc Jones, Dr. Carla Meijen and Dr. Martin Turner onto the show. Hey everybody, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Nice to be here.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, Dan. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, Martin. Great to have you all on. This is a star-studded lineup today. I'm really excited. We've got some returnees. Carla, you've been on before. Martin, as we were joking before, you're essentially now a co-host. But fantastic, a first-time guest, Professor Marc Jones. Marc, so excited to have you on.
Dan, it's great to be here and great to be supported by Carla and Martin, who can help me out and clarify anything I say that doesn't make any sense and fill in the bits correctly.
I'm sure every single word and every single sentence is going to make complete sense. Let's start where we always start. Let's do some introductions. So if you don't mind, Marc, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm a professor of psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University. I have an interest in stress, health and performance. In the broadest sense, we are interested really in how people are able to perform under pressure in those demanding situations. We look at people's responses from a biopsychosocial perspective. So we're interested in how people's bodies change. We're interested in how their thinking changes, their decision making will change, and we're interested in how some of the social factors have an impact on that. So we're interested in how people respond under stress, and we have a series of research programs that sort of explore that, and we've done different work. We have ongoing projects with the European Space Agency in some military settings, with some police settings. We're working as well with some emergency medicine consultants, as well as professional sports teams, where we're collecting data and trying to help and inform coaches as well as players around those broad areas of stress, health and performance.
That magical term, biopsychosocial, and we're going to be talking about stress and performance in sport today predominantly. And Marc, you have been a pioneer in this area in terms of building the challenge and threat states as associated with sport, and we've spoken about challenge and threat states quite a bit on the Sports Psych Show, but today it's exciting to unpack all the new evidence coming through, as well as reflecting on where it all started. Moving on to yourself, Dr. Carla Meijen. Great to have you back on the show. It would be awesome if you could reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on again, Dan. Very excited to actually be on the show with Marc and Martin today. So I'm Carla. I'm an associate professor in applied sports psychology at St Mary's University, where I also lead the MSc that we have in applied sports psychology. My research focuses predominantly around endurance performance and the kind of psychological demands, which we've spoken about in depth before, Dan, and also kind of stress and challenge and threat states. So back in 2007, Marc took the risk of taking me on as a PhD student. And that's kind of where a lot of the kind of challenge and threat journey started. So I do apply that in my work as a practitioner as well. So I'm also an applied sports psychologist. And very recently, I kind of applied that to a little bit of a different field in terms of how can you apply that to the maternity journey, your kind of experience in sport, and kind of see that as a positive challenge and not as a negative threat.
Well, you speak about the maternity journey, and I know you recently released a book, Empowered Birth, and I'm really looking forward to you unpacking some of that for us today with relation to challenge and threat states and anything sports psychology. So really looking forward to doing that. And last but not least, Dr. Martin Turner. Welcome back, sir. Remind us who you are.
Thanks for having me back. Dr. Martin Turner, work with Marc at Manchester Met as a reader in psychology, and probably, if I'm known at all, probably most known for my work in rational emotive behaviour therapy and the application of that to sort of performance settings. But that's kind of, I was getting interested in that and started to explore that really at the same time as I started to explore challenge and threat states with Mark. So Carla mentions there that I think she said she started a PhD in 2007. I sort of arrived 3 years later, was partway through master's degree. Mark says there might be a PhD opportunity here, so started doing that, and it was exploring challenge and threat states. And I was quite fortunate, really, because Mark was developing that idea with colleagues around challenge and threat, and Carla had pretty much solved a lot of the problems that I probably would have had in my PhD around how do we measure this thing, how do we actually understand what challenge and threat looks like from a sort of a biopsychosocial perspective that had its problems and challenges that Carla had kind of figured out and worked out alongside Mark. So I came in with a nice job of picking up the reins and started to develop that further. And then as a practitioner, working over the years, particularly with England Futsal, when I sort of joined that organisation, challenge and threat was essentially my framework of practice. I went into that role with the remit from the coach. We want to be able to perform under pressure. We want to be able to fulfill our potential under pressured circumstances. Is there anything you can do? My go-to thing was challenge and threat. So I used that as a framework to develop a curriculum. So it's been a research endeavour, but also has fed into a lot of applied work that I've done, and I know others have done on the call as well.
Well, I'm mindful that we're using these terms, challenge and threat state, and there's definitely going to be some people listening and going, well, I don't really know what that is. So what I'd love to do is come back to you, Professor Marc Jones, to unpack that for us in simple terms. What challenge and threat state is, and then it would be great to have a discussion about what it means to us as practitioners at the coalface, what it can mean to coaches, and then probably we'll start to explore updates in the theory and its applied implications. So, Mark, coming back to you, tell us about the challenge and threat states. I mean, you're the man who's really pioneered this from a sporting perspective, and you're using it across multiple populations, as you said, the army, police, and so on and so forth. So take us back to the beginning. Challenge and threat. What are you talking about here?
It's a good question, Dan. I think at the core, it's a concept that will be familiar to probably most people listening, both for themselves personally and in terms of the work they do in sport and in other performance domains. The concept that when we're placed in a demanding situation, that sometimes we're able to rise to the occasion and other times we perform below our potential. That there are circumstances where we're able to achieve what we want, and there are circumstances where we fall short of our own expectations. And I think what's interesting about challenge and threat is the idea that in both circumstances, that we're often quite anxious, but sometimes we're able to manage that anxiety, perform to our potential, and other times we're unable to. This isn't a new concept. It's something, I think when we wrote a theory of challenge and threat states in athletes, we quoted Shakespeare, talks about the idea that there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It comes from Hamlet. You go back to some of the early work this century, and Martin's an expert on the Stoics going back to much earlier. But if you look at Hans Selye's work around eustress and distress, then you go, the idea that eustress is a positive response to stress, and distress is a more negative emotional response. You go back to some of the work of Graham Jones and Sheldon Hampton when they were looking at facilitative and debilitative anxiety. This idea that we're anxious, but there's good anxiety and there's bad anxiety. And we were really interested in the work of Blaskowicz, which in turn built on Dean Spear's work on physiological toughness. Again, that people have a response under stress that's helpful to them. That they feel anxious. Yes, they might be worried about what they're about to do, but it's something that enables them to perform well in that situation. And the work of Jim Blaskowicz and colleagues was interesting to us because it provided a physiological response that enables us to distinguish those people that we thought would do well, those who were challenged, compared to those who were threatened and less likely to do well. And that's what really excited us. Part of it was from an applied perspective. Are we able to bring 20 athletes into a room and measure their physiological response and predict who would do well under pressure? Are we then able to understand the underpinning factors to those responses and help coaches, help psychologists manipulate, horrible word, change those states in order to help people perform under pressure? So that's really the concept behind it and the rationale behind it. And we worked on developing the theory of challenge and threat states. Carla led on that, and we were interested in understanding what are the factors in a sports context that might underpin the challenge state and the threat state. And I can talk a bit about those responses, and I can talk a bit about what a challenge state and a threat state looks like.
Yeah.
We think that underpins it. We looked at the sports literature, we looked at the work that people have done exploring challenge and threat states, and we initially said in 2009 we think there are three things that matter here. One's confidence, one's control, and one's an approach focus. And we can probably unpick some of those things a bit later on, but an approach focus is really, I'm focused on what I need to get done here. I feel as though the factors that are the things I need to do are under my control. And you know what? I've done some of these things before, and I feel pretty confident that I can do them. And those resources, those appraisals, provided they are there, we think that enables people to cope with the demands that they're faced with. So provided they have sufficient resources, they're able to cope with the demands of a particular situation. And the key resources for us are confidence, control, and an approach focus. Now, when we see people placed under stress, we see particular physiological patterns or physiological responses. And we're able to measure these. And, we've measured these in the lab, and Carla and Martin have led on this in terms of either using a phenometer, which is a finger cuff, which is the nice and easy way to do it now. But Carla and Martin would have done it using an impedance cardiograph, where they had to put bands on people's chests to look at the resistance to the current and look at the particular responses. But we're able to measure people's physiological responses. The typical protocol is that we get people nice and relaxed. We stress them. We say, look, you're starting in the first team this afternoon, or you're playing against this particular opponent, and then we'll see how they respond. Two things of interest. One, cardiac output. That's the amount of blood that goes to the heart over a minute. And secondly, total peripheral vascular resistance. And that's the resistance in the blood vessels, and that reflects whether the blood vessels are dilated or whether they're constricted. In a challenge response, when people feel that they have the resources to cope with the demands, that they are confident, that they have perceptions of control, and that they are focused on what they can achieve, we hypothesize that there would be an increase in cardiac output, that's the amount of blood that goes to the heart over a minute, and a decrease in vascular resistance because the blood vessels widen. That enables the blood to get to the muscles and the brain a bit quicker. It's an approach response. You've asked me to do something here, Dan. I'm a bit nervous about it, but do you know what? I think I'll be all right. Yeah, I think I'll be able to manage this. In contrast, a threat response is reflected in little or no change in cardiac output, that's the amount of blood that goes to the heart, and an increase in vascular resistance because the blood vessels constrict. It's an avoidance response. Dan, you've asked me to do this. I'm not so sure about it. Do you know what? I'd probably, do you mind if I sit this one out? And that's a threat response. Challenge, increase in cardiac output, decrease in vascular resistance because the blood vessels widen. Threat response, little or no change in cardiac output, increase in vascular resistance because the blood vessels constrict. Challenge is an approach response. Threat is an avoidance response. Challenge is associated with better performance under stress compared to threat.
Thanks so much for that fantastic description. That's really brought it to life. Carla, I'm listening into Mark there, and I'm thinking, wow, not only does this apply to when I reflect back on my golf career. Boy, I must have been in a threat response all the time, given how I felt and the shots that I was hitting. So this applies to us from a sporting perspective. It must apply to us in an everyday life perspective. And as I say, I know you've just written a book that isn't about sports, but is about pregnancy. I mean, maybe you can give us some examples here of how challenge and threat influences sport, life. If you can bring this to life for us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first step that we need to start thinking about is that for challenge and threat states to occur, it needs to be some kind of what we call motivated performance situation. So you want to make sure that there's something like a sense of the unknown, so that kind of uncertainty, that, sense of danger. You might not quite sure whether, when you go play golf, what the outcome would be. So that's and that might be a kind of a threat to your ego. So you've got that kind of sense of, we call danger in terms of that kind of performance setting, but also you want to put some effort in there. So, when we think about that kind of motivated performance situation, if you like, you're looking at that sense of uncertainty, effort, and potential for danger. So this is really important actually to set out at the start, because challenge and threat don't tend to occur if that motivated performance setting isn't there. So something needs to be at stake. I think that's a really important consideration, and kind of bringing that to life. You gave that example of golf. It might be varsity. So this was a big thing when it came to my data collection. So the students were just about going into the varsity, where they were competing against their local other university. And that's actually for, the students was one of the key highlights of the year. There's a lot of stake. Only time of the year really where there were a couple of hundred people watching them. It would never happen at most of the kind of university competition. So a lot of kind of, uncertainty, potential for danger if you're underperforming, and so on. So that's a really nice example. So you've got that kind of competition element that's there in place. And then you start to kind of think about, okay, what are the demands? What's actually at stake? So that initial competition might be the same. They're all competing at varsity, but that's when that kind of element of, those demand appraisals come in. So they might think, oh, we're competing against them. What if like my student, I remember I did this actually, I was competing in one, my students were watching and I was like, I can't underperform here. Like I really need to do everything I can to, show that, I got my emotions under control and all of that. So there was like definitely that kind of demand element in place there. And then you've got those resource appraisals that Mark talked about. So it's that reflection on your belief in your skills. Can I do this? Can I maybe relate to other people in that similar situation who've done well before? When we think about exercise, this is also really important. Maybe you've got like a big CrossFit event coming up, that applies as well. Like, okay, have I done this before? Yes. Okay. Do I have control over this? Yes, I've done everything I could. I've put enough, maybe chalk on your hand for doing some of the pull-ups. And, I've got that approach, folks. I want to do this. So actually what's going on there, those resources outweigh the demands. So we're starting to like work towards that challenge state. And then you've got those physiological consequences. So you feel, those changes in cardiac output and kind of decrease in vascular resistance. And then what happens to your emotions? Well, yes, you might feel a bit anxious, but actually your interpretation of that anxiety is that it will be helpful for competition because you feel you're ready and you care for it. So what we suggest in challenge and threat states is that negative emotions are typically more associated with a threat, but it doesn't mean you don't experience them in a challenge state. You can still experience them, but then your kind of interpretation of those emotions are that they can facilitate your performance. And then you've got all those kind of performance consequences, such as, your decision making is then improved. You kind of engage more with the task, and you might kind of not overthink things too much. I think is the best way to explain that. And then that performance, has positive consequences. So you've got, obviously, sport is such a relevant event when we think about challenge and threat states. It makes so much sense, that uncertainty, danger, effort that needs to go in that. Most times we go out and compete, probably those things occur, and that there's that potential for a challenge or a threat to be there. So that's just kind of just to, maybe bring it to life a little bit more. And then I think it's really relevant as a practitioner to consider what some of those resources are that we can work on when we think about, working with athletes. How can we facilitate that self-efficacy, that self-belief, that confidence? How can we facilitate that perceived control, which, I think is such a key factor. Martin and I did some work on that ages ago around the control triangle. I don't know if you remember that, Martin. It's such a key factor when it comes to resources, that subjective control. It's not what other people think. It's about, do you feel you've got control over that situation? The weather, is a prime example, is often outside of our control. But what can we do to still have that sense of control in that situation? We'll talk a little bit kind of about the pregnancy journey where that's very prevalent. And it's also that approach focus, like really making sure that you don't kind of stick your head in the sand. So how can you approach that? And, things like goal setting definitely play a role there. Think about imagery, self-talk, Martin, RBT. So there's different things that we can do to then really work with athletes to get them towards that challenge state. I think what's really important to remember is that it's a state, so it's changeable. I think sometimes people tend to confuse challenge and threat with traits. And yes, there's a link. There's lots of, Mark can talk about that a little bit more later. But it's changeable, and we talk about that in our 2020 paper, which we can talk about in a bit. But it's really important is how you approach a competition and then what's going on there before you kind of go into that competition based on those resources.
Before we come on to Martin, I just want to hone in on something that you said about your book, Empowered Birth, Carla. My interpretation, therefore, is that there's a whole bunch of tools, techniques, ideas in order to help to-be parents manage their state. Is that really what is contained within the book?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really difficult for people to necessarily change a lot of those demand appraisals. Like you have that sense of uncertainty, there's effort required. But where a lot of the work can be done and to feel more empowered is to facilitate those resource appraisals. So really starting to think about, how can I boost my self-efficacy? How can I boost my perceived control? And how can I boost that approach focus? And there's a lot of psychological techniques that we work on as sports psychologists that facilitate that. And I think that's such an empowering message, because a lot of times, what Mark said, a threat state, you feel that kind of avoidance state. It's not helpful. We know a lot about emotion suppression and the negative consequences that can have. When it comes to birth, you want to have this hormonal equilibrium. And, if you're in that state of fight or flight, it's not going to be super beneficial to you. So I think that's why challenge and threat states provide such a fantastic framework to empower women. There's a lot you can do. Sure, there's a lot of things out of your control, but if you start to tune into that, what you can control, and feel more that you can tackle that situation head on and have that self-belief, then hopefully that'll give that good hormonal equilibrium that will benefit their experience.
I think this is why I love sport and performance psychology so much, is it really can positively impact every area of our life, can't it? Coming to you, Martin, I'm sure, having listened into Mark and Carla there, you're bursting with things to tell us about your experience of challenge and threat at the coalface. And you've already mentioned that you've used it as a framework to consult with a team. But also putting to you, I'm hearing words like appraisal. And as Mark said, you've taken it upon yourself to build your expertise in your career around REBT, which looks to stoic philosophers. But this word appraisal, it's what we're saying to ourselves. It's how we perceive our situation. So you might speak a bit more about that to us there. But Martin, unpack some of your experiences utilizing this framework.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, it's been a really interesting journey for me with this framework because, as I said before, I had these two separate things that I was interested in, REBT and challenge and threat.
Yeah.
And then the more that I kind of delved deeper into things like Stoicism, and as part of my kind of literature review for my PhD, started to understand more and where these things really come from. we're really talking about a cognitive behavioral framework for understanding how people approach performance situations, but not just performance situations, any situation that could be meaningful to us. It could be a difficult conversation, it could be an interview, it could be a sporting performance. It cuts across so many things because the core philosophy is consistent between these approaches, between challenge and threat and RBT. And it really comes down to how you're interpreting your environment and what are the things you can do to influence your own interpretation to shape your response. Now, that response could be emotional, could be actions, behaviors, it could be the way that you think. But ultimately, coming back to some of the stuff Carla was talking about with control, there is a huge amount of potential control that one can have over one's responses and approaches to difficult situations. And I think that's the most important thing for me around the things that I've been looking at, both in RBT and challenge and threat. I mean, they are separable to a certain extent, but they have that core philosophical idea, which really comes from Stoicism, that it's how you think about something that shapes your reactions. And that's kind of not just academically important, it's super important for people on the ground. It means that nobody gets to decide how you feel. It means that even if you face the biggest event you've ever faced in your life, you still get a say in how you approach and how you respond to that event. So it's deeply empowering, and it kind of takes yourself away from the idea that things can make you feel things. It makes me angry, it makes me anxious, it makes me upset. You bring something to the party every time you experience an emotion. Now, certain situations are going to trigger certain emotions more powerfully than others, but you still get a say in how you shape that emotion. And coming back to what Mark was mentioning, when we look at the facilitative versus debilitative anxiety argument, it's a similar idea, really. How do we interpret that emotion once it's been sort of experienced or once it's been activated? Even at that level, we get the opportunity to reappraise and interpret that emotion, and with the view of shaping it towards something beneficial rather than something not beneficial for our performance. So for me, it's as I've started to read more deeply around Stoicism, I just see all these connections between the cognitive behavioral approaches we can talk about, things like RBT, things like cognitive therapy, things like ACT, things like compassion-focused therapy that have these kind of Stoic roots, and challenge and threat has the same roots, that they all exist within the same family. So it's from that core that I've been kind of working both as a researcher and as a practitioner.
Fascinating stuff, and keen to move the conversation on towards the latest advancement in challenge and threat, because I know that, or my understanding is that the framework has, you're constantly looking at this in granular detail, the three of you and others who are involved in the research and on the consultancy side of utilizing challenge and threat state. I mean, coming back to you, Mark, what's the latest in challenge and threat? Where have you taken this? What's going on right now in research, and what are you striving to discover, and what have you discovered?
I think there's a lot of research that's gone on to explore challenge and threat states, and you're right to say that we're always thinking and refining this. One thing I think is always worth saying is that there's a complexity to people's responses. It'll be no surprise to your listeners, I'm sure, that if they're having to coach people or they're having to interact as a member of a team, there's a complexity to people's responses to stress, and that changes across individuals. It changes across time, and it changes across circumstance as well. And what we're trying to do is unpick this. In terms of the research, Carla's work, Martin's work, and others' work has demonstrated consistently that the physiological response that people experience under stress is associated with different types of performance. The research consistently shows that if people have a challenge response under stress, they will tend to perform better than individuals who have a threat response. Remember what those are: increase in cardiac output, decrease in vascular resistance for challenge, little or no change in cardiac output, the blood going to the heart, for threat, and an increase in vascular resistance because the blood vessels constrict. Those patterns, those physical patterns, are typically associated with performance in the way that we would expect. What's interesting in our research is that often the association between the physical response and the self-report measures was often not there. So we'd see a strong physical response, but it wouldn't be associated necessarily with those resources we thought it would be: confidence, control, and approach focus. However, what we have also demonstrated, and Martin has led on this, is that when you change those resources, when you give people confidence, when you give people sense of control, when you give them, encourage them to focus on what they can achieve, that actually manipulates their physiological state, or changes their physiological state. They come across a bit, disconcerting with the use of the word manipulation all the time. I need to think through that. Changes the physiological state, and that's important. That's important for coaches. It's important for teammates. It's important for leaders within the team. That the instructions and the way we frame an event has an impact on the way people respond physiologically. And I think Martin's research, particularly in this area, was really sort of interesting and instructive, if you forgive the pun. That the instructions and the way that we give that guidance, the way we speak to people, has an effect. And that ties in to Martin's point about appraisals. I don't know if Martin wants to come in and just say a bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up, Mark. Well, it's interesting because when I started the PhD with Mark, he said that maybe the first project could be, can we use instructional sets to, sets of different instructions to try to shape challenge and threat with participants. And that's kind of the first study that we sort of attempted to do. And then we kind of circled back and said, actually, we still don't understand how challenge and threat might influence performance. So we did that first, and we found that this challenge state, this cardiovascular challenge state, was able to predict performance in a netball task, in a cricket batting with quite decent level cricketers, and also a cognitive task, a Stroop test. And then we had these instructional sets aspect of the PhD as well. And it was quite striking, actually. And as Mark said there, what was interesting is we were able to create challenge instructions and threat instructions that would influence the cardiovascular response. So those given challenge instructions went into a challenge state. Those given threat instructions went into a threat state. But those changes weren't reflected in what they self-reported. So even though we were picking up from a cardiovascular level these differing states, they didn't self-report that difference. They weren't any more confident or more in control or more approach focused in the challenge condition with the challenge instructions compared to the threat instructions. And that got us thinking, really. And we also noticed that pattern across other studies that we've done, that actually people can't necessarily accurately self-report on these states. But the instructions that we developed, there was one really important key component that I think has huge practical application for our work with athletes, coaches. What we did is we made sure that in both instructions that the demands were the same. So both sets of participants, whether you're in the challenge condition or the threat condition, were told, look, this task you're about to do is difficult, it's uncertain, and there's some danger. It requires some effort, but there's some danger to esteem here. We're going to put your scores on the league table. Other participants are going to see your scores. There's something at stake. We didn't make the challenge instructions easier for participants. We didn't say to them, yeah, don't worry about it. It's really easy. No one cares how you do. Just express yourself. Both instructional sets were stress invoking. The difference is the challenge script, the challenge instructions, encouraged participants to understand that they might have done something similar before, so maybe they'll do well this time, to understand that they are in control of the aspects that might lead to successful performance, and encourage them to focus on the things that could help them in their performance rather than the things they should avoid. And then in the threat instructions, obviously the opposite of that. But both of them had high demands, and in an applied setting, the work that I've done with athletes and teams. It's that acceptance of the demands, not a passive acceptance, but an active acknowledgement that the demands are the reality of a competitive environment, and that you can learn to develop resources and strengthen those resources in order to meet those demands. Don't spend all your time trying to lower the demands of competition, making things easier, reducing the ego threat. Those things are prevalent in that environment by nature of that environment. That is what it is to be in a competitive environment. It's going to be far more efficient and beneficial to focus on developing my sense of self-efficacy, developing my sense of control, focusing on the things that might lead to the outcome that I desire, rather than focusing on avoiding things that I'm fearful of. So that came through our research, and it's something that gave me the confidence as an applied practitioner to really go out into the world and start helping athletes to accept the demands and work on their resources. And colleagues around the country, around the world, have developed ideas and techniques as to how we can influence challenge and threat. The work around imagery, coming from people like Sarah Williams, work from Jameson around reappraisal. There are applied techniques that we already have in our toolkit from the cognitive behavioral tradition, psychological skills training, for example, that can be oriented towards challenge and threat to enable people to experience challenge over threat, sort of when the going gets tough. So that kind of came out of my PhD, and is something that has still influences my practice, to this day.
I love it, and I love the fact all of these, as you alluded to at the end there, all of these tools, techniques from that traditional sort of cognitive behavioural therapeutic approach can be applied with this framework. Coming back to you, Mark, do you want to broaden or expand upon the developments that have been made here?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think what we've tried to do now moving forward, and Carla led on the paper in 2020, is that we were particularly interested to maybe understand a bit more about the physiology of the response. So what else is going on? So when we're looking and seeing cardiovascular reactivity, those changes I mentioned earlier, cardiac output, vascular resistance, what else might be going on? But also to unpick a little bit more about the appraisal process, and Carla and Martin can probably take that, but also then to think about some of the other factors that are crucial, which are particularly around some of the social connections that we have. And I'll pick up those two things quite briefly. On the biology, if we explore people's physiological responses to stress and try to understand what some of the biomarkers might be that relate to good performance under stress, challenge, eustress, whatever you want to call it, or physiological toughness, and then also explore what might be associated with worse performance under stress, with the threat response, then we can then that might be helpful to us. So there's one biomarker that's of particular interest, and that's neuropeptide Y. Now, neuropeptide Y is a neuropeptide that's commonly found across the body, very prevalent in the brain, and particular areas of the brain associated with stress. Now, neuropeptide Y is thought to play an important role in the stress response, and there's some nice research from the early 2000s with military personnel in the United States that have shown that actually special forces soldiers, so people you might expect are relatively good at dealing with stress, have higher levels of neuropeptide Y than more normal or traditional soldiers. Also, military personnel who are asked to perform under stress will have higher levels of neuropeptide Y than those, or perform well under stress, have higher levels of neuropeptide Y than those who don't do so well under stress. So neuropeptide Y is a biomarker that seems to be associated with a good performance under stress, and we think it's associated with a challenge response under stress. What we think the role neuropeptide Y plays is really to shut off the stress response before it continues for too much of a long time. Stress response is normal and necessary. Typically in those individuals who perform well under stress, we will actually see quite a strong stress response, but that stress response will dissipate quite quickly. It's normal and necessary. It's there to help us. But neuropeptide Y really serves in a way at a simple level to stop a significant increase in cortisol under stress and shuts off that system. So we get the initial spike, this normal necessary stress response, but neuropeptide rise associated with shutting that off relatively quickly, and we get a better performance under stress. And so that's one thing that we're interested in. The second thing that we're interested in are the social aspects of it, and I'm sure Martin and Carl will be able to pick up on this. But it's a genuine fascination to me, Dan. As a psychologist, we're always interested in the individual. We're interested in people. How do you feel, Dan? How do I feel at this moment? How do you feel in that situation? A genuine fascination to me, Dan, is how you feel in this situation, how I feel in this situation is related to how connected I feel to others. And I find that genuinely fascinating. As an individual, the way I feel and the way I respond physiologically under stress relates to how connected I feel to other people. I find that genuinely fascinating. And of course, the coaches and people who play team sports will understand a lot of this, that we know that those social connections matter, but they matter not in a abstract concept. They matter in a real concept, not that abstract concepts aren't real sometimes, but they matter in a real concept that it changes the way we respond physiologically. And what we were really interested in to look at social dynamics and how that might, social networks and connections and the role that social factors might play in a positive response under stress. And that links into some of the work that we're doing as well. We're working with a professional sports team, and we're mapping some of the social networks that the social networks within that team and how that relates to the biology of the individuals within that team. Do we see different levels of neuropeptide Y, cortisol, testosterone, and oxytocin, some of these biomarkers that your listeners might be familiar with that are associated with stress, associated with performance under stress. And we're really interested to see how some of those connections link to that. But this concept that when I feel more connected to people, I'm better able to manage the demands. I would have refused to have come on here, Dan, if you didn't have Carla and Martin on here to help me out, you see. I needed those social connections.
You need a good team around you, Mark. I don't blame you. Carla, I'd like to come to you in a second to build on some of the things that Mark said there, but just coming straight back to you, just briefly, Mark, connection. I can understand that completely. It very much shines through in my own consultancy practice, and as I've become a more experienced practitioner, I've realized, I've begun to understand the importance of those social connection. May I just briefly ask you, in psychology we talk a lot about social cohesion, yes, but also task cohesion. You're using the term connection, but if I can borrow from sort of social and task cohesion, and I don't know if this is empirically researched, or perhaps if you can just offer a hypothesis. Can task connection or task cohesion, do you think that could influence challenge threat as well as that more sort of more traditional social connection or social cohesion, or do you think they're all intermixed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know of the research off the top of my head. I would certainly say that these things can be related. I would hypothesize that task cohesion, because of its focus on what we have to do, this concept of approach focus and a clear understanding of roles that you would see within task cohesion, an increased perception of control, and the belief that actually, you know, in this team, the person next to me has got my back. We understand exactly what we're going to do. It would fit in with that confidence. You would imagine that it would be associated with a challenge state. So I think it's a good point, and we'd expect to see similar associations between social cohesion, task cohesion, and a challenge state. You would imagine within a team framework.
And I think again, just briefly before coming to you, Carla, here, I very interesting the way you've answered that, Mark, because you know you're always associating it back to confidence control approach, and I think that that's important, isn't it? Because for those listening in who want to even semi-adopt this, or even just take some of these ideas and utilize them within their coaching practice, you know, just thinking about the processes and practices they're engaging in and relating that to confidence, control, and approach, you therefore are that can be a useful way to consider, is what I'm doing here, my process, my coaching process within my coaching practice, how might this be making a positive impact? Is it through the prism of confidence? Is it through control? Is it through approach? So again, no question mark, but just I like the way you kind of come back to, and I think that's the beauty of being theoretically underpinned, is we can consider these ideas, what we do, with relation to the minutiae of the theory.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's it's as Martin said, it's a useful framework. I think the statistician George Box said that all models are wrong, but some are useful, and I think that it gives us a useful framework to work around. I would like to say one thing about an approach focus, just because I think it's of interest. It's of interest to me probably, but it might be of interest to your listeners as well. That if you read and speak to lots of athletes and lots of people who've been successful, a fear of failure is often reported as a driving force. People have a motivation to succeed because they are worried or they have a fear of failure. And I think often when we talk about an approach focus rather than an avoidance focus, which is the opposite, we can get a bit muddled up with that, because we can think, actually, do you know what? A lot of people who've succeeded in life do so because of a fear of failure has been a powerful motivating factor. How does that fit in within the challenge and threat theory then, or the challenge and threat framework? Well, I think the way I would respond to that is a fear of failure is a powerful motivator. Being worried about something can motivate you in order to go to training, to do the things that you need to do, because there's a fear of what might be coming up on the weekend in competition. But so long as that fear becomes a stimulus to something positive, that, look, I'm worried about my opponent, because I'm worried about my opponent, I'm going to make sure I get that first tackle in. I'm going to make sure that I concentrate and maintain my focus there. That fear of failure or worry or rumination or concern, whatever people want to call it, so long as that is a stimulus to an approach focus. Because Dan is a very quick footballer or a quick soccer player, quick rugby player, I'm going to make sure that I'm on my toes and I don't give him any space. That we use that as a stimulus to an approach focus. I just wanted to say that, because that distinction between an avoidance focus, being worried about what might go wrong, and that fear of failure, and that link to an approach focus, I think is something that's of relevance to people who work in sport, and sort of understanding how they might interact is always a good discussion.
Yeah, and I actually see that. I think obviously very pertinent, but I've always seen it as that fear of failure is an appraisal, and approach focus is a behavior towards, it's an action towards. So the appraisal drives the action towards rather than the action or behavior away from. I remember listening to Andrew Huberman, the Stanford associate professor, who sort of alluded to approach focus being energy forward, which I always quite like, rather than energy back. Don't know how accurate that is, but it's useful. Carla, my apologies, you're sitting there patiently listening in. I mean, it would be great to get any viewpoint you have building on what Marc has said there.
Yeah, I think when Marc was kind of talking about some of the new developments that we talked about in the 2020 paper, I think the first one to kind of build on a little bit is that social support concept. So when we started out, it's called the biopsychosocial approach. So, you've got that biological element, you've got the psychological element. We talk about the resources, self-efficacy, perceived control, approach motivation. And then you've got the social component, which actually, when we look back at my PhD, I looked at it earlier this week, in one of the kind of unpublished studies, we did identify perceived support as a factor, which we then kind of didn't really come back to in the PhD. But then as kind of the work developed, Martin identified some of that in the kind of the 2014 paper, I believe. And actually, when we then sat together and thought about, okay, well, actually, what is important to relay when we think about the kind of where to go, where to move forward with the theory, we all agreed that, perceived social support is such a key factor. we know they can influence that kind of cognitive appraisal process. Mark talks about that, but it also provides that kind of buffer when it comes to stress. So it also has that impact when it comes to some of those physiological responses. So together it can kind of inform that demand resource kind of process that we've been talking about all the time. Like with a challenge, you perceive to have more resources. They kind of outweigh your demands. And when we think about a threat, you don't perceive to have enough resources to kind of manage those demands. And that's really important to then consider actually social sport. We can't really look at sport on that individual level. And Mark made that very clear, but we sometimes get so tied up in our theories and in our work that we kind of, especially, we didn't know a lot to start off with. So you need to look at the different parts of a theory to really start to build that knowledge base. And we're now, I suppose, with some of Martin's work, Matt Slater did some work on that as well, in that position to say, well, actually, this is quite important to consider and to do justice to that whole notion of it being a biopsychosocial approach, which, obviously Mark kind of verbalized very clearly there as well. So perceived social support, there's a whole array of research that kind of demonstrates away from the sporting context how it can offer that buffer when it comes to stress. So it makes sense to bring that into challenge and threat states, as it's such an important component to promote that kind of challenge state.
Really interesting. Martin, I'm sure you've got some things to add there.
Yeah, one of the ways I kind of transpose some of this theory into applied work is when I'm working with players within a team setting, give your mates some resources.
Okay.
If you have that strong, the work we've done on the social aspect has been from a social identity perspective. Carla mentions Matt Slater. There's others in that field looking at the importance of the social domain within these individual appraisals. Give your mates some resources. If you have a strong identification with teammates, you're in the ideal position to influence their stress response through how you interact with them. So yes, you have to kind of, to an extent, look after yourself and develop your own resources for meaningful performance, pressure performance. But how are you going to help people around you to develop their resources as well? So don't just see yourself as this isolated individual who's looking after yourself. Help others and you'll get that return to you reciprocally. The other important factor here is the difference between actual received support and perceived support. And it seems to be that perception of support that seems to be the important factor. The idea that I feel like or perceive that I have people I can go to for support, that I have this idea that I'm connected socially with the people around me, people that matter to me, seems to be more important than the actual support that I receive. So even though we are talking about the social domain to an extent, it still kind of comes down to individual perception about that social domain that starts to become super important. But also, when we were thinking of reconceptualizing the theory, there were certain things that we'd found over the years that we thought we wanted to integrate. But one of the things that kind of links to some of the stuff Carla and Mark have been talking about was this idea of trait threat. It's obviously it's less than ideal sometimes to label people as being threatened or challenged as a trait. But when we've measured trait threat, we see in the data that it predicts the intensification of that threat state when they go into competitions of increasing magnitude. So we did a piece of research with some rowers, and we measured trait challenge, trait threat, and we saw that those who were trait challenged, as competitions got more meaningful, so they went into qualification races, then into European championships and so forth, their challenge state increased. But if they were trait threatened, their threat state increased. So even though these are obviously shapeable and adaptable, there is a sense, to a certain extent, that there might be an approach that you have to pressure, an approach that you have to competition, which does have some disadvantages if that's characterized by threat. Might mean that if you just see the world in a certain way and approach things in a certain way, from a trait perspective, in a sense that it's consistent across competitions, and that will intensify with increasing magnitude. So it's kind of it's a warning, really, in some ways, to try to as an athlete, as a performer, try to make some changes and shape those responses in a really meaningful way and in a deep way, not just for this next competition, but really try to realign how you see performance, really try to shape your philosophy of performance to be oriented towards challenge. Try to really back yourself in life, really take control of the things that you can control, try not to be avoidant, and therefore you can develop that trait. And therefore it makes it easier, more efficient when you're going into competitions that you get that challenge state because it's already nested within you. It's not something that you have to especially do for each competition. It already aligns with how you see competition already. And that's one of the things that we kind of added alongside, irrational beliefs. We're seeing in the research now that somebody with greater, highly rigid, highly dogmatic, extreme beliefs about performance, there's a relationship between those perceptions and the extent to which they see that competition as a threat. We've seen that coming through now in the research. And a piece of research we did with coaches, which links to the social support piece that Carla and Marc have been talking about, we saw that coaches who reflected on a stressful experience and reflected on it as a threat were actually less likely to give their athletes social support. And if we link that back to the resources idea, how can I possibly offer others resources if I don't even have enough resources to take care of myself? So again, even though we are playing within the social domain, there is still an individual element here of me making sure that I'm on the right track and therefore freeing up my resources to offer to other people. If you're a coach that's very stressed, very highly strung, sees things as a threat, the chances of you being able to offer social support to your athletes is diminished. So there's a self-care element there as well, I think, Dan.
I really love the nuance and complexity here. And speaking to nuance and complexity, just sharing from my own consultancy practice, I mean, I tend to use the terms high performance mindset, low performance mindset. I find it quite easy to help people unpack those performance states, if you like, high performance mindset, low performance mindset, which it's not the same, I understand, but it's kind of synonymous with challenge and threat. But one of the things I've noticed over the years when I have helped performers, participants unpack the idea of having a high performance mindset or a low performance mindset is that it's clear to me that some performers will speak about sometimes being in a really great high performance mindset, and then other times kind of just climbing into that high performance mindset and only just about clambering on. Again, I appreciate it's slightly different to challenge and threat, and again with low performance mindset, through conversation, as we've unpacked what happened there as they experience low performance mindset, there's that low performance mindset that is really close to a high performance mindset, and then there's one where they've just gone completely. And we spoke a bit about this a few weeks ago with Bernadette Kellerman about different states of performance. But I did wonder if the research in challenge and threat states has gone on to talk more about the nuance. Are there different types of challenge states? Are there different types of threat states? Is it just simply challenge and threat and that's it? I suppose coming back to you, Marc, to start this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of what we did in the 2020 paper, and Carla and Martin really led on that from the appraisal perspective. I don't know if Carla wants to come in on that and talk about. Sorry, Dan, just to hand over. It's an avoidance response, that, isn't it? Or a supportive response. One of the two.
We'll go for the supportive.
It's just great teamwork. It's great teamwork.
Yeah. So what about I'll set it out, and then Martin can add as well as Marc. So I think what's important. So Martin talked a little bit about that trait, but when we actually think about challenge and threat states in the framework, we talk about it as states, and what that means is they're not static. So I think that's the kind of thing to emphasize at the start. So what we've kind of suggested in the 2020 paper in the revisions is that actually There's and Martin loves this term, the 2x2 bifurcation theory of challenge and threat. There you go, Martin. I managed to get in there.
Thank you for that. That's made my day. I like to not get through a day without hearing the word bifurcation.
Easily pleased.
Exactly. So the whole idea is that when we think about challenge and threat, there's kind of 4 ways that we describe that. So we've got a high challenge state, a low challenge state, a low threat state, and a high threat state. So what is that then? You might wonder. So it's that idea that you have that primary appraisal, that initial kind of challenge or threat appraisal, or kind of evaluation is a better way of saying that. So with the kind of challenge, you then start to think, okay, what about those resources? And in a high challenge state, it's like, yes, I've got those resources. I got sufficient resources to deal with that. And what that then leads to is that kind of positive emotional valence and perception, and you're very likely to fulfill that potential. On the other hand, we've got the high threat. So that's that kind of idea that you have that initial threat evaluation, and then maybe you don't perceive to have those sufficient resources. So we call it insufficient resources. So, there's that goal at stake that gives you that kind of initial evaluation of threat where you feel that there's no goal congruence. And then actually you start to think about your self-efficacy, not have a lot of belief that I can do this, start to think about control. Hey, not quite sure what I can do here. You completely feel overwhelmed, not just the weather, but maybe the opponents. There's someone who thought might be but injured is coming into play, and it might be your nemesis or something like that. If you've got no control over that situation, maybe no control over some of the decisions that your coach might make, tactically might be something that can also feed into that kind of lack of perceived control, and as a result you kind of stick your head in the sand. So together that can then lead to that high threat state, which then is that kind of negative emotional valence, experience negative emotions, and you're much less likely, so unlikely, to fulfill that potential. So you've got that kind of high challenge on one side, high threat on the other side, but then we also have low challenge and low threat. So when we think about a low challenge, you have that initial kind of evaluation. There's that maybe that congruence, but actually when you start to think about those resources, maybe that confidence isn't quite there, maybe that control isn't quite there, and you tend to have more of that kind of avoidance orientation, where you start to kind of move to that low challenge state. So where you experience both negative and positive emotional valence type emotions, and have more negative perception of those emotions. And what then happens is you're less likely to fulfill your potential. And then finally, we've got that kind of low threat state. So that initial threat evaluation, that goal incongruence. But actually, when you think about your resources, hey, I think I can do this. I actually got those resources. I had a wonderful week training. I've demonstrated to the coach that I can do this. I feel strong. I've eaten well. I've slept well. I've done everything within my control. I've actually, feel I can do this. Okay, let's go. I'm going to get out there quick. I know you're fast, Dan, but I feel strong and I can do this. So you start to kind of develop that kind of low threat state where there might be negative and positive kind of valence type emotions, but you perceive them to be beneficial to your performance, and you're actually less unlikely to fulfill that potential. So you become more likely to fulfill that potential as a result, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and Martin, will come to you here to complete this conversation. The high and low challenge, high low threat states. Actually, I've always loved the challenge and threat state framework, but with using nuance and complexity as 2 words here that I think are very relevant when you're at the coalface. Things are messy, things are chaotic, thoughts, feelings, emotions are piled in, and so breaking up challenge and threat to four states, if you like, feels very real. I don't know what your thoughts are on this and how you've utilised this.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important actually, because it means that challenge and threat is limitlessly shapeable. If I go into an environment and I just get this sense we would call it a primary appraisal. I get this sense this is really important, but there's some features of this environment here that are kind of leading me to think this might not go my way. I might struggle here. Okay, so what's my next step? What I need to do is reinforce my resources. Yes, I've had an initial negative, let's call it, appraisal of the situation. Okay, so what's my job now? Let's focus on process. Linking back to your work down with the high performance mindset. Okay, what's my process in getting into the high performance mindset? This isn't about the outcome. This is now about me reinforcing my resources. I'm going to back myself. I've done things similar in the past. I can do it again. I've prepared well. I've taken control of all of the things I can control. I'm focused on what's my first pass going to be like? What's my first movement going to be like? I'm seeing those pictures in my head very realistically. These are things I can control, and they're things that contribute positively to my game. That's my job. I've had an initial negative perception. I'm going to turn that around through some reappraisal work. So what was once a threat state, I'm now turning into, kind of a low threat state instead of going into the high threat state, allowing myself to be bogged down and go down into that negative spiral. Yes, I think it's not going to work out for me. And yeah, I've struggled in the past, and there is some things I haven't prepared well for. I can't stop thinking about that penalty I missed in the last game. That's going to send you into high threat. But I think the caveat to all of this, and how we've positioned this quite carefully, and Carla mentions it there, and sometimes we mention it in passing, but it's important. Likelihood of fulfilling your potential. It's about likelihood. Just because you're in high threat doesn't mean to say you won't win. Predicting performance is a very slippery concept. We can't predict performance. We can put all of the psychological aspects into a bag and use them all to try to predict performance. We still won't be anywhere near really predicting performance. In the research we've done within the challenge and threat space, we went to some netball trials. We tried to predict who would be selected. The biggest predictor of who was selected was attendance at previous trials. Very weakly predicting was the resources. The biggest predictor was previous experience. So, it's a complex thing trying to predict performance. So the focus here is on, are you more or less likely to fulfill your potential? Being in a challenge state isn't suddenly going to make you a Lionel Messi. It just means that you're more likely to get the best out of yourself in that performance environment. To the same extent, if you're normally a very high performer and you're on your A game, you experience a threat state, you might still be able to get through that game and achieve things you want to achieve and come out on top even. So it's not about threat state means you're going to fail, challenge state means you're going to succeed. It's about representing yourself to the fullest capacity. You're more likely to do that if you enable yourself to get into that challenge state through these psychophysiological mechanisms. I think it's really important, Dan, this nuance around these four different states and the idea that it's not a foregone conclusion. If you walk into that environment and think, I'm not sure about this, great, there's things I can do to get into that, to steal your term, that high performance mindset. That's my job now, to get into that state. And then let's see how I perform. Let's use that curiosity. I'm interested to see how well I can perform, given that I've tried to create this challenge state within myself.
And I think to speak to what you've just said there, I've found as a consultant at the coalface over the years, I've written quite a few times recently about two words that I think are probably the most important in my work, and that's narrative and meaning. The narrative athletes have, competitors, participants have, and the meaning behind that narrative. And this is what I love about challenge and threat is if competitors, participants can create a narrative filled with the right meaning around confidence, control, and approach, a little bit like the narrative examples you were giving us there, Martin, then if you can help an athlete be passionate about that, put that up there with technical, tactical, and physical, then that what your work can have a really positive impact here, irrespective of outcomes. Again, as you're saying, nobody can guarantee that. To use my terminology, if I can help somebody have a sophisticated conversation with themselves around high performance mindset, that's more than half the battle won.
I think what you mentioned there in terms of narrative is really important, and the thing that I've been using for a while. There was a guy, Paul Dubois, who is kind of a forerunner to Albert Ellis and a forerunner to cognitive behavioural therapy. He talked to people about telling themselves a first story and then a second story. So my first story might be, looks tough today. This is going to be a tough game. I'm not sure about this. What's my second story going to be? Don't make your second story worse than the first. You've got an opportunity now to shape that narrative and to change that narrative and tell yourself a second story. Now, it's really important that that second story isn't just based in this fanciful, fantasy notion of today I'm going to smash it and that's that. It's got to be grounded in we would say in challenge and threat, self-efficacy, control, and approach focus. But that's got to be grounded in stuff that you've actually done, ways that you've prepared, and processes that you've taken care of. So, yeah, I've certainly used that in my work as well, Dan, the idea of story. What story am I going to tell myself to get myself into that challenge state?
Today I'm going to smash it doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of cognitive flexibility, doesn't it?
Exactly.
It might work, but, look, Carla, just coming to you here, close to closing things off here, but so much of what we're talking about here, again, must be covered in your book, that the narrative, the meaning through a life event like pregnancy. Wow, that must be so pertinent here.
Yeah, definitely. So in my book, I draw on people's, like women's experience of being an active, sport or exerciser, and drawing on that can really help to inform some of those resource appraisals. They can gain a lot of confidence from their previous experiences, even though, it might be the first time you're giving birth. You might have pushed through pain before. You might have managed anxiety, uncertainty. Perceived control is a very big one. Learning to let go. So things like learning goal flexibility is such a key thing. We haven't even touched on that today, but it's a really important thing when we think about challenge and threat states. And that kind of approach focus, again, is really important. And it kind of brings that whole biopsychosocial approach to life, because it goes hand in hand. You can't go into, giving birth without having that kind of, you want to have a nice hormonal kind of equilibrium where that occurs, but also what's happening mentally. If you can give yourself the opportunities to practice different ways to get yourself to that positive challenge approach, you feel more empowered. So it's what Martin talks about when he talks a bit about, okay, let's understand how we can actually try to get you into that challenge state and make it maybe more like a challenge trait. By boosting that, it's a bit like the physiological toughness model when we think about Dean Spear, going back all the way there, is exposing yourself to those situations where you can inform that kind of challenge approach is really important. And that's kind of what I talk about. And, in the different kind of psychological strategy chapters, I go back. I was like, okay, when you think about goal flexibility, how does that benefit your self-efficacy? How does that benefit your approach motivation? How does that benefit your perceived control? And it's the same when we think about imagery. And, in Birmingham, they've done some great work around imagery. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that can promote that challenge state. So we have a lot of tools available to us that transfer across domains. And I think this is where, the challenge and threat framework is so powerful. Like, I took it a little bit out of like the sporting performance domain, but actually a lot of things that we learn in life can come from performance domains. It can benefit us in a very, different environment, like a, giving birth, maternity journey. We can also apply this to music. When we think about the performing arts, Martin and Mark have done a lot of work in kind of different performing under pressure domains. So I guess as a takeaway message there is, my book's about kind of applying that on the maternity journey. And there's a lot to say for that because of the biopsychosocial underpinning of the maternity journey. But there's also a lot of other domains with a lot of exciting opportunities out there to explore going forward.
Brilliant stuff. What a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed unpacking challenge and threat states with you all. Mark, we've worked together. I had the opportunity to deliver for you, with you, on a platform that you built called Sporting Bounce. Can you tell us a little bit about that before we close things?
Thanks, Dan. And just to say, I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And I think, part of this is discussing and talking about some of the issues that are important to performance. And, one of the things we try to do with Sporting Bounce is to connect practitioners from psychology, from sports massage, coaches, injury practitioners and sports nutritionists with athletes who need or are looking for particular support. And that's the part of the platform. So sportingbounce.com, there's membership deals from free through to premium on offer, and it's there to help connect people, sports performance specialists from nutrition, psychology, massage and injury, and coaches through to athletes who need their services. But just from my perspective, it's been brilliant to come on the podcast, and thanks so much for the invitation and the chance to discuss and reflect on some of the issues around the challenge and threat framework.
I'll let you go, Mark. Let us know how people can find you, follow you, and potentially contact you if you wish to be contacted.
Yeah, so easiest way is probably at Prof Marc Jones, MARC. It's Mark with a C. So at Prof Marc Jones on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and yes, a professor of psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University. So put those words into Google search, and hopefully you will end up at my university webpage.
And Carla, how can people find you, follow you, get in contact, and find your fantastic new book?
Yeah, so my website is Carla Meijen, so that's MEIJEN.com, where there's also a link to Sequa Books. I've published my book. It's also for sale on the kind of, well-known book shops. So it's called Empowered Birth, Lessons from Sports Psychology for Your Maternity Journey. Also on Instagram, Carla Sports Psychology, and obviously LinkedIn. You can find me on St. Mary's University as well. So hopefully, and Twitter at Carla Meijen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Dr. Martin Turner, how can people find you, follow you, and get in contact?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so on Twitter, it's at Dr. MJ Turner, spelt DR. And there is a book as well that I wrote, would have been 10 years ago, which lays out the challenge and threat framework that people are welcome to introduce themselves towards, called Tipping the Balance. The idea being that you can tip the balance, have more resources than demands. So I couldn't leave without plugging that. And yeah, if you Google Martin Turner, you get the guitarist from Wishbone Ash. So okay. Don't do that.
Don't get in contact with him asking him for advice on challenge and threat states, although he might have.
He famously knows very little about challenge and threat or ROBT.
Do you know much about playing the guitar?
I know a bit. I know a little bit, but not as much as him, probably. Yeah, we complement each other well.
Martin does have a very large collection of guitars.
Yeah, too large for my musical status.
Whereas the other Martin Turner possibly doesn't have a very large collection of sports psychology literature.
Probably not. He probably doesn't even own Tipping the Balance.
No, who doesn't own Tipping the Balance? I mean, that's appalling. Well, listen, what a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much to all of you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.